Hey there guys, this is Cole. Welcome back to another movie review. As you can tell by the title of today's video, we are continuing on the Superman series of movie reviews. And today, I'm going to be reviewing my favorite Superman movie, Superman 2, released in 1981, starring Christopher Reeve as Superman. Now, for this review, I will only be reviewing the theatrical cut of Superman 2 by Richard Lester. Maybe someday down the road I'll cover the Superman 2 Richard Donner cut, but for right now the theatrical cut is what I'm sticking with, which to be honest, I think that the theatrical cut of Superman 2 is way better than the Richard Donner cut, but I'll cover that sometime down the road. But for right now, I think I'm just going to hold off on that, and I'm just going to review before I see the new Superman movie this year, I'm going to review the 7 previous movies that were theatrically released, and that, of course, is the first 4 Christopher Reeve movies, Superman Returns, Man of Steel, and then Batman vs. Superman. So, we're continuing on the review series today, and like I said, of the theatrically released Superman movies, Superman 2 is easily my favorite, and the theatrical cut of Superman 2, that is, for many reasons I'm going to discuss throughout the course of the review. But, so anyways, what is the plot to Superman 2? The plot of the movie is as follows. Superman, played by Christopher Reeve, foils the plot of terrorists by hurling their nuclear device into outer space. But the bomb's shockwaves freed the Kryptonian villain General Zod, played by Terrence Stamp, and his henchman Ursa, played by Sarah Douglas, and Non, played by Jack O'Harlan, from their imprisonment. Traveling to Earth, they threaten the planet with destruction at the same time that Superman decides to renounce his superpowers in order to live a normal life as Clark Kent, with his new love, Lois Lane, played by Margot Kidder. So that's basically the plot and premise to Superman 2, and what I like so much about this movie is how the plot of this movie, where Superman decides to give up his powers, very similar to the plot of the 2004 superhero movie Spider-Man 2, directed by Sam Raimi, starring Tobey Maguire as Spider-Man, which Spider-Man 2 is easily my favorite comic book movie of all time, but, you know, I'll eventually review the Spider-Man movies sometime down the road, but for now, we're sticking with Superman. How was this movie received when it came out? When the movie was released on April 9th of 1981, very much like the first movie, Superman 2 was a well-received movie by critics and audiences and a smash box office hit. Now, as for my reaction of the movie, Superman 2 is a great sequel that it takes everything that was great about the first movie, but just does it even better, with an even better story. And like I said, there are 2 versions of this movie. That, of course, is the 1981 theatrical cut of Superman 2, directed by Richard Lester. And then in 2006, they did a director's cut of it called Superman 2, the Richard Donner cut, because for those of you who don't know, Richard Donner, who directed the first Superman movie from 1978, Superman the movie starring Christopher Reeve, he was actually fired from the second movie, but after that, you know, Richard Donner, he would go on to direct many great movies after the first Superman movie. He directed The Goonies, which is one of my favorite, childhood favorite movies. That's easily my favorite Richard Donner movie. He also directed the Lethal Weapon movies, which I really like those action movies. Scrooged with Bill Murray, which I think is a great Christmas comedy movie, and that's easily my favorite take on A Christmas Carol. But yeah, I'm getting off track here. But if any of you guys do plan to check out Superman 2, I would recommend do not bother with Superman 2, the Richard Donner cut, which is the director's cut of Superman 2. Do not bother with Superman 2, the Richard Donner cut. If you're going to watch this movie, watch the theatrical version, which is honestly much better. And even the first Superman movie directed by Christopher Reeve, directed by Richard Donner, starring Christopher Reeve, was much better than Superman 2, the Richard Donner cut. And the theatrical cut of Superman 2 was better too. But Anyways, without further ado, let's get into my review of my favorite Superman movie, Superman 2. The movie starts off where Clark Kent, aka Superman, arrives at the Daily Planet and is told Paris is in danger due to terrorists taking it over, and Lois is in Paris, to basically report and do her thing. Clark then decides to run out of the building when his manager is not looking, and then Clark Kent gets into his Superman suit to fly to Paris to protect Lois Lane and save the hostages that are being interrogated by the terrorists. Lois Lane runs to the top of the Eiffel Tower, but the terrorists basically put her in this elevator, but they cut the elevator strap, and so she's falling in the elevator. But then Superman comes to the rescue and and basically stops Lois from falling with the elevator and stops the terrorist. But before all that happens, which is the beginning of the movie, this movie basically gives us a recap of the events that happened in the first movie, and then it cuts to all of that. But anyways, getting back to that, because at the beginning of the movie, if you remember General Zod, he wasn't the main villain. He was not the main villain of the movie, but he was briefly in the first movie. Well, that carries over to this movie because General Zod and his two partners break out of the glass that they are trapped in to follow Superman to Earth without Superman knowing. Basically out of the glass imprisonment that, General Zod and, his two partners were in. Superman then flies Lois Lane back to Metropolis and then returns as Clark Kent. Only Lois has no idea that Clark Kent and Superman are the same person. But of course, us as the audience, we all know that. And then Lois has a conversation and says, Clark, you have to look both ways. Clark then says, geez, Lois, I usually do, Clark then goes into Lois's office to talk to her, and Lois says, you're not jealous, are you? Clark then says, jealousy? No. Lois then cuts an orange and says, when was the last time you heard me sing, huh? And, Lois says, and Clark, don't you have to be jealous? No, she says, and Clark, you don't have to be jealous. Clark then says, I don't. Lois says, no, you have, and then, Clark then says, I do, and then Lois says, do you mind if I give you a bit of constructive criticism? Clark then says, actually, yes. Lois then says, you have to be more aggressive. You have to go from the instinct. See something you want, you go for it. That's what I do. Clark then says, yes, I noticed. Lois then says, Clark, you know that I wouldn't say this stuff to you if I didn't really care. Clark then says, you do? Question mark. And then Lois shakes her head yes and she says, well, what are friends for? And I thought that the chemistry between Superman / Clark Kent, played by Christopher Reeve, and Lois Lane, once again played by Margot Kidder, was believable, like it was in the previous movie. We then cut to Lex Luthor in prison, but this time he is shaved bald, like, he is in the comic books. And Lex Luthor says, this is how it ends. Not with the greatest criminal mind of our time. Not with a whimper, not with a bane. How do they choose to award Lex Luthor greatest genius in this world? Do they give him glory? Do they give him treasure? As for a matter of fact, what do they give him? And then a police officer walks up to him and says, life plus 25 years, now get to work. And then as soon as, the police officer isn't looking, Lex Luthor decides to talk to his partner in secret, and he basically tells his partner he has a plan to escape prison with an invention called the Black Box. The Black Box tracks alpha waves, which is what Lex Luthor explains to his partner. And then Lex Luthor says, these alpha waves will take me north to a secret that will lead me to Superman. The movie then cuts to a scene with a few astronauts on the moon, and one of them is in a space shuttle, and the one in the space shuttle sees Ursa, which is one of Lex Luthor's henchmen, flying across the moon, and she wakes, and she walks up to another astronaut, and she says to him, what kind of a creature are you? The astronaut says, just a man. Ursa then says, a man, question mark. Then Ursa goes full psycho. She rips the tubes out of the astronaut suit, causing him to suffocate. General Zod then attacks an astronaut. The final astronaut tries to escape, but Nan, which is one of the other henchmen, pulls the shuttle down and crushes the astronaut to death. Pretty brutal for a movie that was rated PG. Later that night, Lex Luthor successfully escapes prison in a hot air balloon, because his partner leads him up to it, but his partner wasn't so lucky to escape. I like the scene where Clark and Lois are at a waterfall I like the scene where Clark and Lois are at a waterfall in Niagara Falls, and they're over a bridge talking, but then a kid is about to climb over the bridge, and Clark says, "Be careful," but the kid's mother pulls him down, leading him to safety. The kid eventually falls over the edge of the waterfall. Lois yells, "Help!" But then Clark Kent runs away, becomes Superman, and rescues the kid. Lois then yells, "Superman, it's me, Lois Lane," but Superman flies away. Throughout the course of the movie, Lois Lane begins to suspect Clark Kent and Superman may be the same person, as whenever Clark disappears, Superman always shows up, which, she does have a good point for thinking that. Clark then says to Lois, "I'll meet you at the hotel." And then Lois says to him, "What's your hurry, Superman?" And then Clark questions, "Superman?" Lois then says, "I got to admit, your disguise is nearly perfect. You had me fooled." And then Clark says, "You just have an active imagination, Lois. You can get carried away sometimes." Lois then says, "Listen, I am so sure you're Superman that I'm willing to bet my life on it." And then Clark says, "You really think I'm Superman?" And he was like, "You sure have an imagination, Lois." And then Superman's about to walk away, but he hears and sees Lois Lane jump into the river, and, Clark decides to rescue her without being Superman to convince her that he's not Superman, which does work. And then not long after that, General Zod and his partners, they arrive on Earth. I really like the scene where General Zod arrives on Earth. He walks on water, which amazes a fisherman watching. I thought that scene was rather cool. And then Ursa, which is one of General Zod's henchmen, basically is holding a snake, amused by it, but the snake bites her and she hates it, so she throws the snake on the ground and destroys it with her laser vision. Not long after that, Clark Kent, he is in the apartment with Lois Lane, and he's about to carry her like a rein or something, but Superman accidentally trips with his hand, falling into a fire pit. He gets it out, but Lois is like, "Let me see your hand." But Lois Lane sees that Superman's hand is not burnt, and she says, "You are Superman." Lois says to Clark, and then Clark is like, "Well, what are you talking about?" And then Lois Lane says, "I'm in love with you." And, but then eventually Lois Lane, Superman agrees, eventually, so getting back to it, I like the scene where not too long after that, we cut to a scene where there are two police officers in a car. They're driving. They see General Zod and his two henchmen on the road. One of the cops decides to get out because, they're not moving out the way, and one of the cops tries to shoot with a gun, but, it doesn't do anything. But, General Zod uses his mind to lift up the gun and basically, bends it in half, destroys it. But then I like the scene where Nan, which is one of Zod's henchmen, picks up a car and then drops it with the other officer in it. And then I like the part where Nan destroys the car siren. I thought that was pretty cool. But then eventually, not too long after the confrontation in the hotel, Clark Kent reveals to Lois Lane he's Superman, but Clark Kent says to her, "I better take you somewhere more quiet so the attendant, doesn't get suspicious of anything going on." And, Superman takes Lois Lane on a flight to his secret hideout, which is the Fortress of Solitude, which was established in the previous movie, but that was also a thing in the Superman comics. And I like the scene where General Zod and, his henchmen, they basically go to, like, a village. They basically go to, like, a town, and I like the scene where Ursa, she decides to have an arm wrestling match with a human, but obviously the human fails miserably, and then she throws the human sideways, destroying the table. I thought that scene was pretty funny. Superman but then not long after that, there's a scene where Superman takes Lois, where him and Lois Lane are at the Fortress of Solitude, and Superman decides to ask Lois out to dinner, and, Lois Lane agrees. I really, another thing I gotta give credit to with this movie, I really like the action scenes in this movie, and I gotta give credit. I think that the direction of this movie by Richard Lester is really good, I like the action scene in particular when the military is trying to destroy General Zod and his two partners, but they fail miserably because General Zod and his two henchmen are a lot stronger than them, and, Zod is basically trying to destroy everything in his path. But then General Zod sees that there's like a news anchor type of camera guy, and so Zod is basically on the camera, and Zod says, "Is there no one worthy enough to challenge me?" Like, I thought that was really good, and I gotta be honest, I thought that General Zod was a really good villain in this movie, especially because of the actor who portrayed him. I thought that Terrence Stamp gave a rather great performance as this villain. He was definitely very intimidating. I like the dinner table scene when Superman says to Lois, "If it were not for my father, I would not have met you. But for the first time in my life, everything is clear." And then Lois says, "I'll change into something more comfortable." I thought that was a very heartwarming scene of the movie. And again, I thought that Superman and Lois Lane had really good chemistry together in this movie. And I like the part where General Zod, he's on the news, and General Zod says, "The president will answer to me, otherwise the rest of the cities will end up like this one. I am General Zod, and I am now this world's leader. If everyone does everything I say, innocent people will not die." But then Clark and Lois Lane are basically hanging out at the Fortress of Solitude, but Superman is unaware that the world is in danger by General Zod and his partners who, break in the White House. And Superman uses a chamber machine to get rid of his powers because, he wants to give up that lifestyle and just, have a normal life on Earth. The military tries to stop General Zod and his henchmen, but of course, the guns do zero damage. And I like the part where General Zod says to the president, "Are you the one they call president?" The president then says yes, but then General Zod says, "I see you work," because the General Zod is looking at, like, the floor, and he sees, like, the eagle symbol that the president has in the office. And General Zod says, I see you practice in worshiping things that fly." And he says, "Rise before Zod." The president does what he's told, and then General Zod says, "Now kneel before Zod." The president once again does as he's told, and then General Zod says, "You are not the president. No one who leads so many could possibly kneel so quickly." One of the guys then says, "I'm the president. I'll kneel before you, if it will save lives." General Zod then says, "It will, starting with your own." The guy says, "What I do now for the sake of the world. But there is one man here on Earth who will never kneel before you." General Zod asks, "And who is that guy?" And then the guy says, "I wish I knew." Later in the car, when Superman decides to drive Lois Lane, away from the secret hideout, Lois Lane says, "I cannot believe you gave up being Superman for you." Clark then says, "I didn't do it for me. I did it for us." Clark is then at a restaurant with Lois Lane. A guy steals Clark's seat, and this guy is just an absolute jerk, but that's okay, because this guy who's a jerk, he gets his comeuppance in the movie, which I'll get to that eventually. But anyways, getting back to the scene I was talking about, this guy basically steals Clark's chair, and Clark tries to take it back, but the guy slaps Clark in the back of the head. But since Clark got rid of his powers, he feels the impact when he falls over. Clark Kent gets up and tries to fight the guy, but Clark's bleeding, but the guy punches Clark and knocks him down again. Lois tries to fight the guy who attacked Clark, but he puts her on the table and says, "I don't like your meat anyways." The waitress then decides to turn on the news after the guy leaves, and on the TV, the news says, "We interrupt this program for an urgent message from the President of the United States." The president then says, "This is your president. On the behalf of my country and in the name of everyone else in the world, I hereby amputate all authority and control over this world." Basically meaning he's given it up. Basically what the president's trying to say is that the president's no longer in charge and General Zod is. He's the world leader. Only by strict compliance with all the directions will all the directions with the lives of innocent beings be spared. Superman, can you hear me? Superman, where are you? And then General Zod looks into the camera and says, "Who is this Superman?" The president says, "You'll find out." And when you do, but then General Zod interrupts, and then General Zod says, "Come to me, Superman, if you dare. I defy you. Come and kneel before Zod." Superman then says to Lois, "I have to go back. I have to try something." Lois then says, "This is not your fault. You did not know this was going to happen." Superman then goes back to his fortress and tries to get his powers back, and Superman says, "Father, I failed you." But then, I like the part where Lex Luthor, who once again is played by Gene Hackman, tells General Zod Superman is the son of Jor-El, and he wants Zod to destroy Australia. Lex Luthor then shows up at the Daily Planet along with General Zod and his henchmen, and Lex makes Zod try to kidnap Lois Lane, and Superman shows up to fight General Zod and his two henchmen. General Zod throws a wall at Superman, but Superman destroys it with his laser vision. And then Non, which is the bigger of the henchmen, throws Superman into a wall. Superman gets up but is grabbed by Non, and Ursa tries to hit Superman but misses, and she hits Non. I like the part where General Zod uses his laser vision and tries to destroy a truck, but Superman deflects it with a metal shard, which damages General Zod part of his head. Ursa then throws a sewer lid at Superman, causing Superman to go flying, and his back basically hit the front of a car. But then General Zod throws Superman into a truck. Then Superman throws Zod into an electric sign, shocking him, which does slow him down a little bit. But then Nod and Ursa pick up a bus. They throw it sideways, but Superman stops the bus. However, he doesn't get out right away, so everyone thinks that Superman is dead, and this obviously upsets all of the citizens in the city, and the citizens decide to start throwing stuff at General Zod, but Ursa and Non are stopped by Zod's, but basically the citizens are stopped by Zod's super breath. Superman then gets out from under the bus, and then Superman flies away. But then Ursa and Non and General Zod decide to fly away with Lex Luthor and Superman to basically take them to the Fortress of Solitude. But as I said earlier, the chamber, it basically takes away powers. But getting back to what I said, because that does play a part into it, Superman shows up to the Fortress of Solitude to stop the bad guys and save Lois Lane. Ursa says, and because Superman's about to snap General Zod's neck, Ursa says, "Release the General or we will tear her apart." But then Superman decides to release General Zod, and Zod says, "Superman will be my slave forever. If he is not, all those Earthlings he protects will pay for your defiance." Zod then makes Superman go into the chamber to get rid of his powers, but Lex Luthor decided to switch the machine, so Superman will still have the powers, but anyone he touches who has powers, it'll make them lose powers and make them weaker, which I thought, okay, that was smart. But then I like the part where General Zod makes Superman kneel, but then, Superman, grabs Zod's hand, but then he crushes Zod's hand and throws him into the pit down below. And then Lois knocks over Ursa by running up and, and then she runs up and hugs Superman. And I like the part where Lex Luthor says, "Our plan did it, we worked." But then Superman's not too keen on Lex Luthor, and but Lex Luthor says, "Oh, come on, Superman, hear me out before you say no. Superman, I have a proposition for you. Let's wipe the slate clean, you and me. Give me a ride back, and I'll go stay in my own lair, and that's it. But then, near the end of the movie, Superman, he's flying with Lois Lane and says, "We can fly wherever you want." And then Lois says, "I'll never tell them who you really are." Superman then says, I know, Lois Lane, I know." And then Superman drops off Lois Lane at her apartment and flies away. The next day, Clark Kent shows up to work in Lois's office. Clark kisses Lois. Clark then leaves, goes, and I really like the ending of this movie where Clark decides to go to the restaurant he was beat up at earlier in the movie, and Clark Kent, he meets the guy who beat Clark up in the movie, and Clark says to him, because basically the jerk who beat up Lois Lane and Superman is at the bar, and he's like, "Serve me more of this trash." And then I like the part where Clark Kent says, "That's funny. I've never seen garbage eat garbage before." And then Clark says, "You're sitting in my favorite seat." And then the guy says, "Come and get it." And then he punches Clark, but obviously, because Clark has his powers back, he feels nothing. And when the jerk punches Superman with his hand, that obviously hurts the guy's hand. And then I like the part where Clark Kent, he puts the guy on top of the table and says, "This order is to go." And then he pushes the guy across the table and he lands on top of a pinball machine. I thought that scene was funny. And then Clark Kent says, and then Clark Kent pays the owner and he says, "I'm terribly sorry about the damage, sir. I've been working out." And then Clark walks away. And then the movie ends where he is Superman flying with the American flag. He puts it back on top of the White House and he says, "Sorry for going away, General. I won't disappoint you again." And then the movie ends with Superman flying over the earth and smiling in the camera like the first movie. So yeah, this was a long-winded review, but this is honestly one of my favorite movies of all time and my favorite Superman movie. So I felt like this lengthy review was worth it. And yeah, great sequel all the way around. And like I said, if you're going to watch Superman 2, watch the theatrical cut from 1981. Do not bother with Superman 2, the Richard Donner cut. If you're going to watch this movie, watch the original theatrical cut. But yeah, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to give Superman 2 a 9 out of 10. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching my review. And next up, I'll be reviewing Superman 3 sometime soon. We'll catch you guys later. Bye-bye.